Hello, guys. So today we'll be talking about the Iranian Revolution, and we'll be seeing the events that led to the revolution, and how it has not only shaped the modern Iranian politics, but also the Middle East and the world politics. So stick with me as we take a ride. The Iranian Revolution is the story of a powerful king who lost control of his country after many years of growing anger among his people. It begins in 1941 when Mohammed Reza Shah Pahlavi became the ruler of Iran. He wanted to make Iran modern and similar to Western countries. But however, many people felt he depended too much on foreign powers. So this feeling became stronger in 1953 when Iran's elected leader Mohammad Mossadegh, was removed from power during the 1953 coup d'etat. This coup d'etat was assisted by the United States and the United Kingdom. So after this coup d'etat, many Iranians believed the Shah was being, influenced and controlled by Western power. So they didn't really trust him again. In 1963, the Shah introduced major changes called the White Revolution. And these reforms included giving the poor farmers. The reforms were basically aimed at, making Iran a modern and industrialized state. And of course, you really can't talk about industrial modernization without talking about westernization. Okay, so the Shah really wanted Iran to be a modern state, and in his words, he said that he wanted that 25 years from now, as at then when he said the 25 years from now, that he wanted Iran to be named among the top 5 prosperous countries of the world. So these reforms included giving land to poor farmers. The Shah ended feudalism, improved education, and allowed women to vote. And this was going to be a major issue, as we'll see, because women were given freedom. Okay, it wasn't no longer compulsory. It was no longer necessary for women to be putting on veils in public. And of course, apart from just voting, women at some point were also allowed to actively involve in politics and hold offices. But this was seen as as directly against the fundamental principles of Islam. Although these changes sounded positive, but they created new problems. Wealthy landowners lost their power. Religious leaders felt that Islamic traditions were being ignored, yes, and especially, with the involvement, with the freedom that was given to women. So many religious leaders, felt that Islamic traditions were being ignored, and Iran was being influenced by Western powers, especially the United States. And then there were agitations because of these reforms that were going on, especially the fact that it was directly eroding the culture and the tradition of Iran at the time. So the Shah also had a secret police called the Savak. These secret police, they arrested and silenced anyone who criticized the Shah. So this even made people to be more afraid, and angry at the government. one of the strongest critiques of the Shah was the religious leader named Ruhollah Khomeini. Ruhollah Khomeini. He spoke out against the Shah's policies and his close relationship with Western countries. Khomeini was an Islamic scholar, okay, and he believed that the Western control over Iran was too much and it wasn't acceptable. So, because of his teachings, and growing influence in Iran, the government were scared of a possible outbreak of protest or revolution. So they decided to exile Khomeini in 1964. So 1964, Ruhollah Khomeini was exiled to Iraq, to a place called Najaf. So, but however, this exile still did not, they didn't do much. They didn't really do much, because while he was in Najaf in Iraq, his tips and teachings still managed to get to circulate around Iran. They still smuggled into Iran and then circulated around there. So many persons began to see him as a religious leader who stood for justice and the right standing of religion in the country, who stood against foreign influence and against the authoritarian manner with which the Shah was ruling. By the late 1970s, life in Iran had become more difficult. Prices were rising, jobs were hard to find, and corruption was common. And in January 1978, protests, had already started. Especially when a government-backed newspaper insulted Khomeini. So many of the students took to the streets and started to protest. And when the police, tried to stop them, they ended up killing some persons. And then it was a tradition among them that a memorial will be held for, the dead after 40 days. So what happened was that at every time of the memorial, when people gathered to mourn the dead, it ended up to be another protest again. So it ended up being another protest. So memorial after memorial were just protest after protest. So the cycle just continued, and because of this growing outrage and the influence, the pressure from the Shah on the Iraqi government under, I think, Saddam Hussein at the time, the government of Iraq, had to exile Khomeini again. So they chased Khomeini out of Iraq. So what was his options? To go to Europe? He was suggested that he should go to Europe, but he didn't want to. But at last, he decided to go to France. By the end of 1978, the situation was out of control. The strike stopped businesses and oil production, and millions of people filled the streets demanding change. So this situation was so bad, it was getting out of control of the government. So the Shah actually came out to give a speech, and said that he had heard the revolution and that they should give him a second chance. And in fact, if there was ever a doubt about the weakness of the Shah, that speech, changed everything, because the speech really confirmed that indeed he was weak. Reza Pahlavi was a good leader in terms of in time of peace, with his reforms and modernization and industrialization. But that period really showed that in the time of trouble and pressure, he couldn't meet up. He was really weak. So, and also he was also struggling with cancer at the time. So he was weak. His speeches were weak and so on. On January 16th, January 16th, 1979, the Shah left Iran. So he left Iran to Egypt. Said he was going for vacation, but actually that was the last time he was going to set his foot in Iran. Because of the pressure, he could not maintain the pressure. So he had to, run away. So, shortly after he left, Ruhollah Khomeini returned to Iran, and he was welcomed by a huge crowd. Millions of people, took to the streets to welcome him. It was seen that he was a savior. Khomeini's message was simple. He said he accused the Shah of being a puppet in the hands of the devil. Now, the devil now being the United States. So, and he was committed to putting an end to that. In 1979, that was when the monarchy collapsed. Now, the monarchy had lasted for like 2,500 years. So 2,500 years history of Pasha monarchy collapsed, and it paved way for the theocratic Islamic Republic. After the fall of the Shah, the country needed new system of government. So in April, if I'm not mistaken, April 1979, the people voted to create an Islamic Republic where religion would play a central role in leadership. So Khomeini became the most powerful figure in the country, and new laws were based on Islamic principles. You understand? So, Western influence was reduced, and the political system changed entirely. So later that year, 1979, so tensions with the United States led to the Iranian hostage crisis. The Iranian hostage crisis, when American diplomats were taken hostage in Tehran, that was what the Iranian hostage crisis was about. American diplomats were taken hostage in Tehran. It happened because many Iranians were still angry about the US supporting the Shah, and feared further interference. They were afraid of further interference. The crisis lasted for about 444 days, and this really worsened relations between Iran and the United States. So guys, do well to subscribe to my channels, like and drop your comments, your opinions, and also share so that others can learn and to know the dynamics of world politics, of the global politics as of today. So see you guys as we have more exciting topics to discuss. Yeah.